Number 7. Christina Pongrax. A 29-year-old woman by the name of Christina Pongrax was brought to trial over the death of her elderly boyfriend, William Herchenrider, in 2010. 77-year-old Herchenrider, a wealthy man from Good, Virginia, was found badly beaten in his home on May the 4th. After being hospitalized for several months, Herchenrider ultimately passed away from his injuries in August. Following an autopsy, his death was ruled a homicide, and his girlfriend, nearly 5 decades his junior, was determined to have been the perpetrator. Pongrax had reportedly grown angry at Herchenrider after he'd expressed his intention of ending their relationship and kicking her out of his Bedford County mansion. Pongrax proceeded to attack him with his own walking stick, inflicting the severe injuries that would eventually lead to his demise. She was arrested a day after Herchenrider had been brought to the hospital and initially charged with aggravated malicious wounding. However, following the victim's death, prosecutors decided to pursue a first-degree murder charge against Pongrax. Her fate was determined in February of 2012 when she was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the brutal beating of her boyfriend. Herchenrider had sparked up an intimate relationship with the young woman roughly a decade prior to the incident, when she was just 18 years old. Number 6. Paul Gonzalez. 45-year-old Paul Gonzalez of Los Angeles, California scammed at least 20 women into paying for exorbitantly priced gourmet meals in a series of dine and dash incidents that subsequently became infamous. Gonzalez was out of work and with no income on which to rely, he formulated a criminal plot centered on manipulating women into paying for his food. The scheme was fairly straightforward in structure, as Gonzalez would go on various online dating sites to court his victims. He invited them out on lavish dates to some of Los Angeles' most popular high-end eateries, restaurants like Tam O'Shanter and Smitty's Grill. After ordering excessive amounts of food, Gonzalez would come up with an excuse to leave the table, often telling his dates that he had to make an important phone call. He would then take off without paying for the expensive meals he'd ordered, leaving his unsuspecting victims to pick up the check. Gonzalez later became known as the Dine and Dash Dater after a woman named Marjorie Moon posted about her experiences with the scammer on Facebook. She said that Gonzalez had ordered $250 worth of food and drinks on their date before leaving her, a single mother of 5 children, to pay for it all. Her post went viral and she was invited onto radio and television programs to expand on her story. This helped lead to the discovery of 20 women in total who came forward with dates, the course of which had been very similar to Moon's. Gonzalez was eventually charged with 7 counts of extortion, 2 counts of attempted extortion, and 1 count of grand theft. Although he faced a maximum penalty of 13 years in prison, he was ultimately sentenced to 120 days behind bars. Number 4. Titus Clarice. After skipping out on around 100 restaurant bills and earning a reputation as Belgium's most prolific dine and dasher, 35-year-old Titus Clarice was found dead in January of 2014, having been repeatedly stabbed inside his apartment. Residents of the medieval university town of Ghent had long known of Clarice's devious exploits, and despite the illegality of his actions, he had become somewhat of a mini-celebrity within his community. He was a man of humble means who was said to have lived off government aid for much of his adult life. His welfare checks amounted to less than $50 a week, but Clarice still insisted on dining at some of Ghent's most expensive establishments. After gorging himself on extravagant meals for which Clarice knew he hadn't the money to pay, he would simply inform the restaurant of his inability to cover the bill. Sometimes he would be allowed to walk away consequence-free, but he also spent a number of nights in jail due to his brazen and compulsive dine and dash antics. He claimed not to mind the nights behind bars, insisting the hearty meals he'd enjoyed were well worth the punishment. In 2009, Clarice was fined approximately $2,000 and sentenced to 6 months of house arrest for his behavior. Even so, he continued his rampant freeloading until the day he died. Authorities struggled to establish a suspect in his killing, though some have speculated that Clarice was murdered by a maligned restaurant owner still harboring a grudge over an unpaid bill. Number 2. Carol Richardson. 47-year-old Carol Richardson was arrested by Houston police in September of 2020 after it was discovered that he'd been illegally housing more than 30 elderly and disabled individuals in a dilapidated nursing home. Officers who arrived at the scene described the conditions of the home as deplorable, as cockroaches had infested the building while Richardson had neglected to provide adequate food and medication for the ailing people residing at his unlicensed group home. It wasn't the first time Richardson had been found unlawfully operating a home for individuals in need of care. In fact, at the time of that particular incident, Richardson was out on bond from a separate case in which he was accused of assaulting a disabled person who lived in one of his decrepit group houses. It's been reported that the man was running a total of 7 homes for the elderly and disabled. He regularly used residents' debit cards for cash withdrawals, or in one instance, to purchase $1,000 worth of supplies for his church, even though he was only authorized to use the cards for his residents' monthly rent charges. In July of 2021, Richardson was granted 5 felony bonds and was released from jail. Just a month later, however, he was charged with 2 more felonies for injuring an elderly or disabled individual once again. Subsequent updates on the case indicated that the authorities were still attempting to locate Richardson, who had been on the run since his release. Number 1. Christina Ott. Utah woman Christina Ott, a Layton native, fell victim to a pernicious romance scam that turned her into a criminal's unwitting money mule. In September of 2020, Ott had taken to online dating platforms to try and find a partner in the aftermath of her recent divorce. The retired woman was in an arguably vulnerable state of mind when she was first targeted by an individual looking to use her to discreetly launder money. Her internet suitor appeared to be someone searching for love and was seemingly on the same wavelength as her. However, as their relationship progressed, it soon became far more financial in nature. The pair came up with a plan to open up a restaurant in Salt Lake City. At that point, Ott's boyfriend began asking her to deposit large amounts of money into her bank account, claiming that the cash was flowing in from investors in their business. She would then transfer the money back to him, ostensibly to pay for various expenses relating to the construction of their restaurant. Ott claimed to have moved a total of roughly $1 million through her account over the course of their online relationship. When the man she believed to be her boyfriend continually refused to meet her in person, she began to grow suspicious. Ott cut off communication with him, stopped transferring his money, and filed a report with the Layton Police Department. 5 months later, Ott went to visit her nephew at a military base, but in order to be allowed on the premises, she had to undergo a background check. After being asked to wait for over an hour while the verification process was being completed, Ott was arrested in front of her grandchildren. Reportedly, there was a warrant out for her arrest in Powell County, Kentucky. She was on the receiving end of a Class C felony charge relating to the financial misdeeds she had unknowingly helped facilitate for her boyfriend. Prosecutors offered her a plea deal that dropped the felony charges and instead required her to pay a $5,000 fine. Number 7. Slobodanka Tosic. In 2015, Slobodanka Tosic, a former Miss Bosnia, was arrested in Croatia and extradited to her home country to face charges in connection to the attempted assassination of a local gangster. Tosic was a central figure in one of 32 people targeted in an undercover investigation codenamed Operation Doll. It was aimed at a series of gangland killings and robberies that Interpol estimated at close to $6 million. The most severe of the charges levied against Tosic was the attempted murder of gangland figure Georgi Zadrail. While serving 20 years for an unrelated murder, Zadrail testified of the hit that nearly ended his life and how Tosic had lured him into an ambush in 2006. At the time, Tosic was dating Darko Ilez, a rival of Zadrail's and a man alleged by investigators to have run one of the largest groups in organized crime in Bosnia. The model, knowing that Zadrail was infatuated with her, sent him a text asking for a ride to the village of Pavlovac, Croatia. Once they were there, Tosic reportedly gave a hand signal and Zadrail's rivals opened fire on him. He survived the assassination attempt and, in the aftermath, Tosic fled to Serbia. In spite of her criminal affiliations, the model's career blossomed as she appeared on the cover of Serbian Playboy and on an equivalent of the Survivor TV show. As investigations into Ilez's criminal activity progressed and Operation Doll was set in motion, the former Playboy model was arrested. In 2016, she was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. Number 6. Renato Sibra. In December of 2012, male model Renato Sibra was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison after he was found guilty of killing a man with whom he'd been involved and mutilating his body. Sibra and 65-year-old Carlos Castro both from Portugal, had arrived in New York City in late December of 2011. They reportedly attended some Broadway shows and spent New Year's Eve in Times Square. A year prior, Seabra was a contestant on Pursuit of a Dream in his home country, which hunted for modeling talent. He wasn't the winner, but did emerge with a modeling contract. He had met Castro, a celebrity television journalist, through Facebook, and while multiple sources described the two as a couple, some referred to the latter as Seabra's sugar daddy. Friends whom they'd visited in New York speculated that there was friction between the two men towards the end of the trip, allegedly stemming from jealousy. Then, Castro's brutalized body was found in a room at the Intercontinental in Times Square. Investigators determined that he'd been struck with his laptop and a wine bottle prior to being castrated with a corkscrew. He later succumbed to his injuries, and shortly after the attack, law enforcement apprehended Seabra at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital, where he'd sought care under his real name. The model was charged with second-degree murder, to which, during his trial, he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Seabra's defense maintained that he'd suffered a psychotic break and believed to be on a mission from God to kill Castro, whom he saw as possessed by a demon. After bludgeoning the victim to death, Seabra claimed he'd worn his testicles as a bracelet and drank his blood. Prosecutors argued that the model had committed the grisly murder because Castro was trying to end their relationship. In the aftermath, he disconnected the hotel phone and dismantled the victim's cell phone before stealing $1,600 from his wallet and their flight itinerary, apparently intending to flee. Mental health experts diagnosed Seabra with bipolar disorder, but the notion that he'd been in control of his actions prevailed, and a jury found him guilty of murder. Number 4. Bruna Cristina Menezes de Castro. In February of 2021, Brazilian model Bruna Cristina Menezes de Castro turned herself into the authorities in the Goiás state for failing to attend prior hearings and court-ordered community service appointments. The 31-year-old model, whom local media outlets dubbed the Barbie of crime, had been convicted of purchase fraud in September of 2015. She had accepted payment for 2 mobile phones which were never delivered. While the incident spearheaded her conviction, local authorities reported that over 100 people had complained of being scammed by De Castro, who hadn't sent them their ordered products, citing family or health issues. The model had also allegedly posed as her own father to scam her ex-boyfriend by falsely claiming she had cancer and needed money for treatment, conning the man out of over $2,600. She handled her illicit gains through at least 10 different bank accounts. A Guyana judge took into consideration that she was the mother of 2 underage children during sentencing and opted for house arrest, community service, and a fine equivalent to 10 minimum wages. De Castro paid the fine but did no community service and missed all of the 6 hearings she was supposed to attend. The authorities faced difficulty in locating her as she'd changed her address without notifying the court, prompting a judge to conclude De Castro was perhaps thinking she was above the law. The model surrendered to the authorities after a warrant had been put out for her arrest on February the 18th of 2021. Number 3. Jaime and Claudia Ray. Colombian model Jaime Ray was arrested at an airport in the capital city of Bogota in 2016 while trying to flee the country to Miami. 21-year-old Jaime and her sister Claudia had warrants out for their arrest after they'd allegedly kidnapped and tortured fellow model Carolina Munoz, aged 23. The incident followed a social media dispute between the sisters and Munoz, who'd later admit to the police that she'd created fake Twitter accounts and shared unflattering photos of the sisters, reportedly showing them before they'd gotten plastic surgery. Jaime and Claudia found out that Munoz was responsible, and on January the 31st of 2015, they abducted her from a Bogota restaurant and drove to a remote spot in the countryside. It was there that the Rays submitted her to prolonged torture throughout the night. Munoz would subsequently claim that her torment included being hit, bitten, electrocuted, and having her hair shaved off. The sisters also cut her clothes and left her completely naked. They then forced Munoz to surrender her social networking passwords and subsequently uploaded naked photos of her on the internet. Jaime and Claudia threatened Munoz that should the feud continue, they'd throw acid on her face without ever facing legal consequences because they knew powerful people. The victim was abandoned in the street and she later contacted the authorities. Updates indicated that Claudia was still at large at the time of Jaime's arrest. Number 2. Liliana Venegas. In late March of 2016, Canadian businessman Alvin Mulhai was in Miami, Florida, celebrating his brother-in-law's bachelor party. In the early hours of the morning on March the 28th, the 40-year-old was approached by Liliana Venegas, aged 25, outside of Nikki Beach nightclub, after the model, originally from Bogota, Colombia, reportedly told him, "I don't like young boys, I like men." The pair went back to Mulhai's room at Lowe's Hotel. He'd hoped that they would become intimate, but the model told him she'd had too much to drink. They fell asleep next to each other after downing a few more shots, but later, Mulhai awoke to Venegas rushing out of the room. He then noticed that his $28,000 Rolex was missing and chased after her, but she was able to escape after a friend picked her up in a Mercedes-Benz. Miami police caught up with Venegas and her accomplice shortly after and arrested them both. It was subsequently revealed that on February the 19th, she'd run a similar scam on a man named Robert Mokia, whom she'd drugged before making off with $30,000 worth of valuables, including a Versace chain and a luxury watch. On February the 15th, the career criminal had gone home with a couple that she'd met at a club called Rockwell, Miami. After they'd fallen asleep, Venegas stole various valuables estimated at around $14,000. The couple recognized her from a mugshot subsequently shown to them by the authorities. Venegas was charged with grand theft in the Mulhai case as police continued their investigation into her criminal activity, suspecting that others had been victimized. Number 1. Paulina Karina Diaz. Colombian model and TV presenter Paulina Karina Diaz was arrested in 2017 as part of an investigation into an unsolved case of blackmail and kidnapping from December of 2011. Local authorities reported that Diaz had taken advantage of her looks to lure businessman Hugo Lopez Moncayo and lawyer Milton Caro Villamil into a room at a Cali club. Accomplices then locked them inside and subsequently asked for an estimated $1 million in ransom, but Moncayo and Villamil were never seen again. By the time that a kidnapping task force identified Diaz as having played a role in the incident, 2 other people had been convicted and sentenced to 23 years in jail. Prior to her arrest, the 23-year-old model had been presenting a sports section on a show called Guaya Magazine on Channel 2. According to her employers, Diaz worked without a fixed salary in a bid to increase her fame and social media reach. A man only identified by his nickname as La Bruja, or the Witch, was arrested alongside Diaz, and he'd been allegedly tasked with monitoring and guarding the kidnapping victims. A capture photo of Diaz and La Bruja in front of an official billboard was released, but no further updates on their legal situation have been made available by Colombian authorities. Number 7. Zoe and Joan Lee. In January of 2018, Englishwoman Lisa Hall, aged 44, accompanied her daughter Holly during a night out in Bognor Regis, West Sussex. At about 11:30 p.m, the mother of 3 reportedly decided that she was too tired to continue the evening's activities and called her husband to come pick her and 23-year-old Holly up. While the Halls were awaiting their ride home, a young woman later named Zoe Lee approached the pair and aggressively insulted Lisa in a seemingly random verbal assault. Lee then proceeded to unleash a brutal physical attack on the woman, in the perpetration of which she was aided by her own mother, Joan. It was later reported that Lisa blacked out after she'd been punched to the ground, kicked and stomped on by the hostile mother and daughter. When she came to, Holly was standing over her with tears in her eyes. Her husband, who by then had arrived at the scene, insisted that she go to the hospital. The vicious attack left Lisa with a shattered ankle that required intensive surgery to repair. Investigators ultimately concluded that Zoe and Joan Lee had targeted the victim because they were envious of her physical appearance. They were both charged with causing grievous bodily harm and consequently imprisoned for 5 years each. Number 6. Charles Jessup. After ending her relationship with Charles Jessup in 2019, Claire Nash began receiving an incessant stream of texts and phone calls from the man, who went as far as to claim he was going to take his own life if they didn't get back together. Jessup sent the 33-year-old woman 95 messages on Christmas Day 2019 and an additional 174 over the next several days. It was reported that Nash had contacted the police about her ex-boyfriend's harassment on 3 separate occasions within a 6-week period, but she chose not to make an official complaint against him. On the morning of January the 16th of 2020, a local law enforcement officer reportedly determined that Nash was at medium risk of being the victim of a domestic violence incident. That same day, Jessup went to the woman's home in Suffolk, England, where with a kitchen knife in hand, he waited for her to arrive. Later that evening, Nash's new boyfriend was alarmed by the sound of screaming on their front doorstep, allegedly hearing Jessup say, "I said I was going to do this to you." He then dialed 999 as an altercation between Jessup and Nash had spilled into the house. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but they were ultimately unable to stop Nash from succumbing to the multiple stab wounds she'd sustained. Jessup reportedly told officers, "I have won," several times as they were arresting him, with the attack believed to have been related to him growing envious that Nash had moved on since their breakup. Following his criminal trial, he was sentenced to a minimum prison term of 30 years. Number 5. Cordelia Farrell. On October the 14th of 2019, Wayne Coventry was found dead at his brother's house in Broomsgrove, Worcestershire, England. The 36-year-old had reportedly gotten into a heated argument with his girlfriend, Cordelia Farrell, which had escalated into a physical altercation. The row culminated with the latter fatally stabbing Coventry with a kitchen knife. Speaking to the authorities after the deadly incident, Coventry's mother described her son's relationship with Farrell as toxic, also claiming that it was characterized by violence and jealousy. The mistrustful and envious attitude with which Farrell allegedly approached her relationship with Coventry had previously given rise to other violent outbursts. One such instance had occurred only weeks prior to Coventry's death, when Farrell bit the man in his groin region during an argument. Subsequent reports detailed how, on the night of Coventry's killing, Farrell plunged the knife directly into his chest and pierced his aorta, which caused him to bleed out within minutes. Following the attack, 38-year-old Farrell fled the scene, and she remained on the run until turning herself into the authorities 5 days later. Although she would be ultimately cleared of the charge of murder, Farrell was convicted of manslaughter after being tried at Worcester Crown Court, and she was consequently sentenced to 10 years in prison. Number 4. Dominic Barragan. Englishman Dominic Barragan's relationship with his girlfriend began to erode in the summer of 2017 as, according to court documents, he had begun to exhibit bizarre behavior that severely unnerved his partner. On one occasion, Barragan had allegedly made her stand up so he could cover her body in plastic wrap. In spite of the woman's repeated protests, the 25-year-old, who described himself as a devout Christian, was reported to have simply laughed at her discomfort and thrown her onto the bed. After she continued to express her discomfort with the situation, Barragan begrudgingly gave up on his advances. At a later time, when she conveyed the fact that she was still upset from the incident, the two reportedly got into an extremely animated argument that culminated with Barragan strangling the woman while lying on top of her. The altercation left her with bruises and scratches on her neck, after which she broke up with Barragan and began temporarily living with her mother. While she was away from her home, in July of 2017, Barragan reportedly broke into her residence and found an open box of condoms on her bedside table. Jealous and enraged, he then ransacked his ex-girlfriend's house before setting it on fire. The following day, Barragan turned himself into the police and he was charged with assault and arson. He was consequently sentenced to 3 years in prison, and he was also issued a restraining order that barred him from making any form of contact with his ex-girlfriend. Number 3. Mary Connier. Naomi Oni, a Victoria's Secret shop assistant from London, England, was attacked by a woman wearing an Islamic niqab after leaving work on the night of December the 30th of 2012. As was captured on CCTV footage, the female assailant had followed the 22-year-old out of the Westfield shopping centre in Stratford and proceeded to tail her all the way home. When Oni approached her residence, the woman emerged from the shadows and threw acid all over the victim's body, inflicting horrific burns to her face, leg, chest, stomach, and arms. Oni's extensive injuries, one of which included being left nearly blind in one eye, ultimately required 2 facial reconstruction surgeries to mend. Following an investigation into the matter, local authorities identified 22-year-old Mary Connier as the perpetrator of the acid attack. The young woman had been close friends with Oni since childhood, but they'd reportedly had a falling out a short time prior to the incident. Court documents detailed how Connier had grown envious of her friend's complexion and appearance. She also alleged that the victim had called her ugly during a previous interaction, and she'd thus premeditated the attack as a cruel form of retaliation. The revelation of Connier's involvement in her friend's disfigurement proved surprising to many, including Oni herself, who'd unknowingly gone to her attacker to commiserate with her in the incident's wake. Connier was ultimately jailed for 12 years, following a criminal trial at Sneersbrook Crown Court in London. Number 2. Ryan Abbott. Chelsea Morris of Cheshire, England, was in a tumultuous relationship with Ryan Abbott for 3.5 years. Throughout that period in time, which Morris herself described as rocky, 28-year-old Abbott would allegedly get angry and jealous whenever his girlfriend, who was 7 years his junior, went places where there might be other men present. As a consequence of Abbott's extremely controlling behavior, the young woman had lost touch with many of her friends during the course of their relationship. In March of 2019, Morris got a job at a local store which reportedly bothered her boyfriend, as she would be required to interact with a large number of people. The young woman decided to move back in with her parents to get away from her abusive partner. However, during a celebratory dinner with loved ones, Morris was confronted by Abbott, and she misguidedly agreed to accompany him back to his apartment. It was there that Abbott allegedly flew into a drug-fueled rage and began berating Morris about interacting with other men. He briefly withdrew to his kitchen before emerging with a machete that he then used to stab Morris in the back and slice her right ring finger. Abbott subsequently fled the scene and continued his violent outburst in the surrounding neighborhood, jumping on cars, emptying trash bins, and smashing the glass windows of adjacent houses. For his various offenses, Abbott was later jailed for 4 years and was also given a 5-year restraining order, barring him from contacting his ex-girlfriend upon his release. While Morris survived the attack, she was reportedly left so emotionally affected by the incident that she refused to leave her house for a long time afterwards. It was also reported that she faced the risk of not being able to properly use her injured finger again. Number 1. Brandon Clark. An Instagram influencer from Utica, New York, was brutally murdered by her romantic partner on July the 14th of 2019. As was detailed in a police report created in connection to the incident, the victim, Bianca Devins, had gone to a concert in New York City with her boyfriend, Brandon Clark. Accompanying them was another male friend of the influencers, who was only identified by his first name as Alex. Following the musical performance, Devins and Clark returned to Utica, where they reportedly got into a contentious argument. The latter confronted Devins and, in a jealous rage, alleged that he'd seen her kissing Alex at the concert. The situation soon escalated, and the 22-year-old man assaulted Devins before he pulled a large knife out from under his car seat and slit her throat. Following the attack, Clark called several of his family members, who contacted 911 in fear of what the man might do to himself or others. Clark then posted pictures of Devins' dead body to social media. Although Instagram ultimately removed the photos from their platform, they faced criticism for waiting nearly a day after they'd been uploaded to take them down. As law enforcement officers arrived at the scene of the murder, Clark sliced his neck in a failed attempt to take his own life. He was taken into custody and charged with second-degree murder. In February of 2020, Clark entered a guilty plea, and in March the following year, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Number 7. Kirill Belarusov. French film producer Laureline Garcia Berthaud was reported missing on March the 5th of 2019 after she'd failed to show up for work at the PR firm Golling, where she was an executive assistant. In the days leading up to her disappearance, several of her friends reportedly received text messages sent from her phone, the nature of which they would later describe as strange and confusing. The text indicated that Garcia Berteau had gone on a shopping spree with her ex-boyfriend, Kirill Belarusov, who'd allegedly offered to purchase her a new home. The producer's friends were surprised, considering their knowledge of the latest developments in the former couple's relationship. Belarusov, an aspiring stuntman, had been emotionally abusive towards Garcia Berteau for months prior to the messages being sent, and he also reportedly owed her thousands of dollars. The day after she'd been reported missing, Garcia Berteau's body was found buried in a shallow grave in the garden of her Kew apartment. Investigators identified Belarusov as the likely perpetrator of her murder, as he'd been captured on CCTV footage at her flat. He'd also been spotted buying a series of items including trash bags, duct tape, and an axe, which the authorities concluded was part of a kit he would later use to kill Garcia Berteau and clean up the scene. Following an investigation, it was determined that Belarusov had won back his ex-girlfriend's sympathies by faking a cancer diagnosis. He then spent a couple of days with the woman after unfoundedly promising to buy her a new home. Garcia Berteau eventually discovered his various lies and presumably confronted him. At that point, Belarusov strangled her to death with a cable which reportedly took over 4 minutes. Once she was dead, Belarusov bound her arms behind her back, wrapped trash bags around her body, and discarded it in the garden. Afterwards, he sent text messages from her phone to some of her friends before fleeing to Estonia. He was eventually tracked down, arrested, and extradited back to the UK, where he was ultimately convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison. Number 6. Christian Gerhardt-Reiter. In the late 1970s, German teenager Christian Gerhardt-Reiter befriended an American couple who were traveling in West Germany. He would later use their names to obtain permission to enter the United States, falsely claiming that they'd invited him to stay with them at their California home. By 1979, Gerhardt-Reiter had settled in Berlin, Connecticut, where he was living with the family of author Edward Savio. Over the course of the next several years, Gerhardt-Reiter used a multitude of aliases as he traveled across the country, pretending at various times to be an actor, a physicist, a ship's captain, and even an English aristocrat. In 1995, while living under the name Clark Rockefeller, he married a successful businesswoman named Sandra Boss, whom he'd reportedly convinced that he was a descendant of American oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller. Boss eventually filed for divorce from Gerhardt-Reiter, citing his secretive and controlling tendencies as reasons for their deteriorated relationship. She also hired a private investigator who would make the discovery that Gerhardt-Reiter was not in fact a member of the Rockefeller family. On August 2nd of 2008, the imposter was arrested for having abducted his daughter while she was visiting him. Following his criminal conviction, he was sentenced to 4 to 5 years in prison. By the spring of 2009, investigators had identified Gerhardt-Reiter as a person of interest in the 1985 murder of Jonathan Sohus. He'd previously been a tenant in a guest house owned by Sohus's mother, and it was ultimately determined that he'd bludgeoned the man to death before hiding his remains. Gerhardt-Reiter was convicted of first-degree murder in 2013 and subsequently sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, with credit for the 1 year he'd already served. Number 5. Mark Nye. In February of 2020, police officers in Surrey, England, pulled over a vehicle driven by a man who would subsequently identify himself as Connor. According to reports from the authorities, the suspect had been stopped while he was trying to dispose of a package containing illicit substances and a pair of cell phones. The police also reportedly found hundreds of business cards for McGregor Enterprises inside his vehicle. The man was identified as 34-year-old Mark Nye, and he was placed under investigation by local law enforcement, who later found a large amount of boric acid in his home. They also discovered hundreds of text messages on his phone that detailed his various dealings as a purveyor of illegal drugs throughout suburban London. It would later emerge that Nye had modeled his appearance after MMA fighter Conor McGregor and was using the celebrity's name and likeness to promote his criminal business. Nye ultimately pleaded guilty to possession with the intent to supply Class A drugs, and in April of 2021, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Number 4. Vincent Marks. An off-duty Assumption Parish Sheriff's deputy was involved in a near collision while traveling down Louisiana Highway 70 on June the 10th of 2021. Shortly thereafter, a vehicle moved closely behind the deputy and began flashing its headlights continuously. The officer eventually pulled into the parking lot of a convenience store, and the car that had been following him reportedly parked directly behind him, blocking in his vehicle. The driver of the second car approached the deputy and presented him a badge, allegedly represented himself as a police officer. The deputy, however, recognized the man from a domestic incident that had taken place in Pierre Part earlier in the year, and thus knew that he was not, in fact, a member of law enforcement. A subsequent investigation into the incident uncovered that the police impersonator was 27-year-old Vincent Marks, a Plaquemine resident. He was arrested and charged with felony false impersonation of a peace officer. He was booked into the Assumption Parish Jail and his bond was set at $10,000. Number 3. Heather Garcia. On August the 31st of 2019, law enforcement officials in Farmington, Utah, pulled over a silver BMW upon noticing that it didn't have a license plate. The driver of the vehicle claimed not to have any form of identification with her, reportedly telling the officers that her name was Mercedes and that she was born in 1998. The police performed a search of her car, at which point they found drug paraphernalia and a white, powdery substance inside. The officers then discovered an ID card in the driver's purse and were able to identify her as 38-year-old Heather Garcia, which didn't correspond to the name she'd initially given them. It emerged that she'd actually provided the deputies with her daughter's identity. A preliminary records check indicated that she had multiple outstanding arrest warrants in Davis County. Garcia was consequently taken into custody and detained on several drug-related charges, as well as charges of driving with a revoked license and offering false personal information to a police officer. Number 2. Anna Sorokin. In the summer of 2013, a young woman named Anna Delvey traveled to New York City to attend the semi-annual New York Fashion Week. The 22-year-old was on location working as an intern for the French fashion magazine Purple. Delvey left the publication a short time later, but she decided to remain in New York to establish the Anna Delvey Foundation, a private members club and art organization. She reportedly struggled in her initial attempts to obtain funding for her idea from members of the city's social elite. A local club DJ named DJ LD would later tell investigators that Delvey had claimed she was a wealthy German heiress during a party at the luxury hotel called the Standard Highline. Over the next few years, Delvey reportedly relied on the purported inheritance promised to her by her illustrious German heritage to make connections with prominent artists and entrepreneurs. Some of them agreed to help bring her vision for the Anna Delvey Foundation to fruition. She organized expensive dinner parties and moved from one boutique hotel to the next, constantly avoiding paying her bills by promising wire transfers that never materialized. Eventually, on October the 13th of 2017, Delvey was arrested in Los Angeles County, California. It emerged that Delvey's real name was actually Anna Sorokin, and that her claims of being the heiress to a large fortune had been entirely fabricated. From 2013 to 2017, Sorokin reportedly stole a total of $275,000 from financial institutions, banks, hotels, and many of her acquaintances by forging bank statements and neglecting to pay off the debts she accrued. In May of 2019, she was sentenced to 4 to 12 years in prison after being found guilty of 8 charges, including second-degree grand larceny. Sorokin was released on parole in February of 2021, but was ultimately taken back into custody by Immigration and Customs Enforcement for allegedly overstaying her visa. Her case inspired a Netflix television series entitled Inventing Anna that was released in February of 2022. It centered on Sorokin's elaborate fraud and was reportedly the most watched program on the streaming service during the first week of its release. Number 1. Shanna Golia. Starting in 2012, Nebraska man Dave Krupa began receiving an incessant stream of emails and text messages from his ex-girlfriend, whom he'd only dated for a couple of weeks. The harassment, which began shortly after the end of Krupa's relationship with 37-year-old Carrie Farver, continued for the next 3 years. Throughout that period of time, Krupa was sent tens of thousands of messages. The man reportedly changed his cell phone number several times, but Farver always managed to obtain his new contact information and thus resume her unwanted communications. In a televised interview with ABC, Krupa recounted how He'd once received a chilling message from his stalker that detailed the exact position he was in on the lazy boy chair in his living room. Detectives uncovered that there were also threatening messages sent from father's social media account to another one of Krupa's ex-girlfriends, Shana Golia. The situation abruptly turned violent when the latter was allegedly assaulted by Krupa's crazed former partner. Golia's house was vandalized and set on fire, and she suffered a gunshot wound to the leg. The authorities soon became suspicious of Golia after detecting a number of inconsistencies in the story she'd given to the police during her interviews. Upon investigating the matter further, the authorities built a case against Golia, who, in a dramatic twist of events, was identified as Krupa's true stalker. The woman was revealed to have perpetrated the damage to her property herself before shooting her own leg in an attempt to portray herself as a victim. Body parts were found in her possession that investigators were able to link to father, whom they determined to have been murdered on November the 13th of 2012, the last day she'd been seen alive. Golia had reportedly set her murderous plan into motion after growing jealous of Krupa's relationship with father. She impersonated a woman after killing her and began relentlessly tormenting her ex. In 2017, the scorned lover-turned-murderer was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 18 to 20 years for second-degree arson. Number 7. Dennis Nickel. In March of 2016, a Chicago man was arrested for using a jammer to illegally suppress cell phone signals on the subway during his commute. 63-year-old Dennis Nickel, whom some media outlets dubbed the Silent Vigilante, worked as a financial analyst at the University of Illinois Hospital. He would later claim that he'd bought the jammer, which blocked cell phone signals in its vicinity, as he'd been desperate for a quieter commute. Nickel was exposed by IT worker Brian Rader, aged 30, who posted a picture of him on Reddit as he was actively using the jammer. Such devices are illegal to buy or use because they can shut off police radios and block emergency calls. They were initially developed by the military to disrupt surrounding communications during negotiations or hostage crises. The photo of Nickel quickly circulated online and caught the attention of law enforcement. Members of the Chicago Police Department, CTA, and the Federal Communications Commission set up an undercover sting operation. On March the 8th of 2016, Nickel was taken into custody on felony charges. According to updates on his case, he'd managed to avoid jail time and was given a deferred sentence after pleading guilty to misdemeanor charges for using an illegal device. Number 6. Nick Cross. A vigilante from Geelong, Australia, was charged with the murder of a 29-year-old woman in December of 2018. Nick Cross was known in the community for starting a vigilante group in 2016 after a group of teenagers had tried to break into his home while he hid inside with his daughter. Others in the community joined his initiative, and Cross claimed at one point to have 260 residents patrolling the streets with him. The group's activities gradually diminished following pressure by the authorities for citizens not to take the law into their own hands. In late 2018, Cross had no fixed address and had reportedly developed an addiction to crystal methamphetamine and heroin. The 31-year-old was arrested along with Todd Darrell Sell and Tracy Menzies, both aged 34, at a house in Sydney's West, where they'd reportedly been staying for less than 24 hours. The trio were taken into custody by police in tactical gear a few days after the charred remains of Madison Parrott had been found at the Geelong Showgrounds on the outskirts of the Victorian town. The 29-year-old woman had been living in a glamping-style tent following the recent breakup of her marriage. The motives and circumstances of her killing remained unclear. Cross was accused of shooting her in the head at a different location, then moving the body to the tent and setting it ablaze. Sell and Menzies were charged with accessory to murder after the fact. A sentence for Cross hasn't been pronounced, but during a hearing at Geelong Magistrates Court, he violently lashed out at the officers present in the courtroom, gave them the middle finger, and claimed that the state's police takes kids. Number 5. Nestora Salgado. In 2013, US woman Nestora Salgado from the Seattle suburb of Renton was arrested and detained in her birth state of Guerrero, Mexico, on criminal charges in connection to her vigilante group. After building a life in Washington, the woman would periodically return to her hometown of Olinala and help those in need. Indigenous communities such as Salgado's were allowed under state law to form their own vigilante groups. The woman, then in her late 30s, and others sprang into action after a local taxi driver was killed for refusing to pay protection to a drug cartel. The community police of Olinala was founded in response, of which Salgado became a commander. The armed organization patrolled the area and reportedly sought to protect the rights of indigenous inhabitants, as well as to keep them safe from cartel violence and government corruption. Salgado was detained by the army in August of 2013 along with several others in the community police on charges of kidnapping and organized crime. The main focus was the community police's detainment of 3 teenage girls suspected of dealing cocaine, as well as that of a well-connected town official accused of doing the narcos bidding. Salgado was imprisoned without a trial for 2.5 years, during which she was denied proper access to attorneys or adequate medical care. She eventually went on a hunger strike that brought international attention to her plight. Salgado was released in March of 2016 after a judge considered there was a lack of evidence to support the accusations brought against her. Number 4. Christopher Hughes. On February the 5th of 2021, an Australian woman died after she was struck by a vehicle driven by a vigilante while riding her motorbike in Townsville. 22-year-old fitness enthusiast Jennifer Board, who aspired to become a Queensland police officer, was traveling along Ross River Road. Simultaneously, Christopher Hughes was in pursuit of a stolen Hyundai iX35. The 25-year-old was described as a known vigilante whose sole focus in life, as court documents indicated, was hunting down car thieves. He was driving a Holden Statesman, which was also occupied by his girlfriend and a friend, both of whom were live streaming him chasing down the Hyundai on Facebook. Hughes was allegedly going over 70 miles per hour when he tried to ram into his target car and lost control of the Statesman. The vehicle became airborne and spun into the path of Board's motorcycle in the opposite lane. A devastating collision occurred, resulting in the young woman's death. Hughes, whose license had been suspended or disqualified 10 times since 2012, was charged with her murder in December of 2021, and his case is ongoing. Number 3. Bernard Goetz. Amidst the rising crime rates characteristic of New York City in the 1980s, an incident on a subway train in Manhattan garnered immense media attention and prompted national conversations on the limits of self-defense, vigilantism, and race relations. While riding on the subway on December the 22nd of 1984, Bernhard Goetz was approached by Barry Allen, Troy Canty, and Darrell Caby, all aged 19, and 18-year-old James Ramseur. They surrounded Goetz, blocked his path, and asked for $5. Believing he was about to be robbed, the 37-year-old brandished a revolver and shot each of the teens once. All 4 survived, but Caby was left paraplegic and brain damaged as a result of his injuries. Goetz, who initially fled but later surrendered to the authorities, was dubbed the Subway Vigilante. In the high-profile case, he was both praised and vilified in the media and public opinion, as some demanded a conviction for attempted murder, while others regarded him as a symbolic avenger of New Yorkers' frustration with rising crime. Further tension stemmed from the fact that Goetz, the son of German immigrants, was white, while the teens he'd shot were black. An investigation by the Office of the U.S. Attorney determined that the shooting's triggering factor had been fear rather than race. Following several trials, Goetz was acquitted of attempted murder and only charged with carrying an unlicensed firearm, for which he served 8 months of a 1-year sentence. He filed for bankruptcy after Caby obtained a civil judgment of $43 million against him. Goetz, who became a public figure in the incident's aftermath and an activist for a tougher stance on crime, unsuccessfully ran for mayor of New York City in 2001. The subway vigilante most recently came into public attention in November of 2013. He was arrested for allegedly selling marijuana to an undercover female police officer, but the case was dismissed about a year later. Number 2. Shauna Ford, Jason Eugene Bush, and Albert Gasciola were members of the vigilante group Minutemen American Defense, or MAD, who carried out a gruesome home invasion in May of 2009. Founded by Ford in 2007, MAD was an anti-illegal immigration group, the members of which patrolled the Arizona-Mexico border. Bush was Ford's second-in-command and reportedly had ties to white supremacist groups, while Gasciola provided intelligence about drug activities in the area. Ford, then in her early 40s, and her 2 accomplices gained access to the Arivaca home of Raul Flores Jr. by pretending to be acting in official capacity and looking for fugitives. Because of Flores' alleged drug connections, they expected to discover a stash of illegal substances and cash that would help fund the vigilante group. The trio only found inexpensive jewelry, which they took prior to executing Flores and his daughter at point-blank range. The man's wife, Gina Marie Gonzalez, survived after being shot 3 times. She armed herself with her dying husband's handgun and called 911. While she was on the phone with an operator, Ford, Bush, and Gacciola returned, and a shootout ensued between them and Gonzalez. Bush was hit in the leg, prompting him and the others to flee. His wound was treated by a fellow MAD member who would subsequently become a witness for the prosecution. Following their arrests and trials, Ford and Bush were sentenced to death, while Gacciola was given a sentence of life in prison plus 54 years. Number 1. Phoenix Jones. American man Benjamin Fodor, better known as Phoenix Jones, earned considerable media attention as a real-life superhero. Fodor decided to adopt the Phoenix Jones persona in 2010, when he was in his early 20s after reportedly becoming disillusioned with law enforcement's handling of crime in Seattle. He had extensive martial arts training, on which he relied when intervening to break up various criminal incidents. His mask and costume, which were predominantly black with gold detailing on the chest and eyes, consisted of a dragon skin brand bulletproof vest and stab plating. He patrolled the streets equipped with a stun baton, tear gas or pepper spray, handcuffs, and a first aid kit. From 2011 to 2014, Fodor was a member and de facto leader of the Rain City superhero movement, a group of Seattle residents who, like him, adopted costume superhero personas and patrolled the streets. Some of them included Buster Doe, Green Reaper, Torn, Gemini or Mantis, and Fodor claimed that all of those in the organization were skilled in martial arts. As Phoenix Jones, Fodor successfully intervened and prevented several crimes, including inebriated driving, drug deals, vehicle thefts, and a number of fights. In the process, he was shot, stabbed, and had his nose broken on separate occasions. Public opinions on Jones remained polarized, and some, including Seattle City Attorney Pete Holmes, leaned towards identifying him as a misguided vigilante. This perspective became rooted in fact, particularly in light of Fodor's arrests. The first had occurred in October of 2011 when he was taken into custody for investigation of assault after he'd used pepper spray on 4 people to allegedly break up a fight. Those involved claimed that no altercation had occurred and that the masked man had attacked them. He spent 7 hours in jail before posting the $3,800 bail, and the case against him was ultimately dropped. During the proceedings, Phoenix Jones revealed his identity in court and pledged to continue patrolling the streets. His transition from superhero to villain was further solidified in January of 2020 when he was arrested as a suspected drug dealer. He had allegedly tried to sell MDMA to an undercover police officer, and law enforcement also reported that Fodor and an accomplice were in possession of 4 grams of cocaine. Number 7. Orlando Tercero. Binghamton University nursing student Haley Anderson went to Orlando Tercero's apartment after a night of partying with friends. In the early morning hours of March the 8th of 2018, the two were captured together by surveillance cameras, with the footage constituting the final time Anderson was ever seen alive. A few hours later, Tercero was recorded leaving his apartment alone when Anderson failed to return home the following day. The 22-year-old's roommates tracked her phone to Tercero's residence and broke in through a side window, thereupon finding her dead body in his bed. After an autopsy was conducted at Lord's Hospital in Binghamton, Anderson's death was ruled a homicide by manual strangulation, and investigators began searching for 22-year-old Tercero, who had become their prime suspect. However, it later emerged that after murdering Anderson, Tercero had fled to Nicaragua. He was eventually arrested by Nicaraguan officials at a local hospital, where he'd been taken up shortly after his arrival in the country. Tercero ultimately faced the charge of femicide in Nicaragua, of which he was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. He was also reportedly charged with second-degree murder in Broome County, New York. In the aftermath of the incident, details of a past relationship between Tercero and the victim were brought to light. Subsequent reports indicated that the man had become obsessed with Anderson after the pair had briefly dated. Tercero wanted to continue their romantic involvement, while Anderson told him she wished to keep their relationship purely platonic. He killed the woman in a fit of rage and jealousy upon realizing his hopes for a romantic future with her weren't reciprocated. Number 6. James Fairweather. On March the 29th of 2014, James Atfield, a father of 5 from Essex, England, was found bleeding in the grass at Castle Park in Colchester. After being stabbed repeatedly, paramedics rushed to the scene, but their last-ditch attempts to save the 33-year-old's life proved fruitless. Local police were reportedly startled by the exceedingly brutal nature of Hatfield's murder, as he'd been stabbed more than 100 times by his then unidentified attacker. Although it was determined that the victim had been drinking heavily on the day, the defensive wounds on his arms and hands indicated that he was conscious during the assault and had attempted to fend off his assailant. A few months later, a 31-year-old student at the University of Essex was found dead in the overgrown grass near her home. The victim, Nahid Al-Manea, had reportedly been stabbed in the abdomen and eyes before being left for dead on June the 17th of 2014. During their initial investigation into the pair of murders, the authorities interviewed dozens of local residents with a history of knife-related crimes, one of whom was a teenager named James Fairweather, who'd been convicted of knife-point robbery in January of 2014. Fairweather was able to provide an alibi that initially eliminated him from consideration as a suspect in Hatfield and Al-Manea's murders. In May of the following year, however, a concerned dog walker reported seeing the teen loitering in the early morning hours with rubber gloves and a knife. Fairweather was taken into custody, and during his subsequent interviews with a psychiatrist, he allegedly told them about hearing voices in his head that urged him to commit acts of extreme violence. The psychiatrist later testified that the teen had some of the most antisocial and violent thoughts they'd ever heard from a patient. Investigators found documentaries about serial killers such as the Yorkshire Ripper in Fairweather's possession, and it was determined that he developed an obsessive interest in mass murderers before ultimately becoming one himself. In April of 2016, he was found unanimously guilty of murdering both Hatfield and Al-Manea. He was consequently sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 27 years. Number 5. Terry Kelly. On October the 16th of 2021, a young child named Cleo Smith disappeared from the Blowholes campsite in the Gascoyne region of Western Australia. It was discovered during an interview with the child's mother that she'd gotten up at about 1:30 a.m. on the previous night to ask for water before going back to sleep. When her parents woke up the next morning, Smith had vanished, along with her sleeping bag. They quickly notified the police, who organized an extensive air, land, and sea search that same day. On October the 21st, the Western Australia Police Force announced that they were treating the case as a kidnapping, and they reportedly offered a reward of roughly $700,000 for information that led to Smith's recovery. The child remained missing for 18 days before she was finally located, alive and well, inside a locked house that was only minutes from her family's home in Carnarvon. Investigators detailed how they'd used forensic leads that allowed them to obtain a search warrant for the home. According to a report by the Daily Mail, the alleged perpetrator of the abduction, 36-year-old Terry Kelly, had an obsession with dolls and had a room full of toys in his house, even though, according to his neighbors, he had no children of his own. The police revealed that Smith was playing with some of Kelly's toys when officers recovered her from his house. The man was charged with multiple offenses, including forcibly taking a child under 16, and appeared in Carnarvon's magistrate court in early November of 2021. He eventually pleaded guilty to kidnapping in January of 2022 and faced a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. His motives weren't clear, but some speculated that his obsession had led to him seeking a living doll to add to his collection. Number 4. Jessie J. Stalker. In June of 2011, English pop singer Jessica Ellen Cornish, who released multiple studio albums under the stage name Jessie J, suffered a broken foot after falling off the stage while rehearsing for London's Summertime Ball. Not realizing the severity of the injury, Cornish continued to walk on her injured limb for 2 weeks, which only exacerbated the break. She was eventually forced to wear a walking boot for several months, but it was reported that she'd suffer arthritis for the remainder of her life and would be unable to wear high-heeled shoes without experiencing extreme pain. In the wake of the incident, 24-year-old Cornish began receiving strange and disturbing messages from a teenage fan who had tracked down the singer's private contact information. Among the texts Cornish had received was an image of the teen's broken leg. After developing an unhealthy obsession for the celebrity, the teen had allegedly self-inflicted the fracture in an effort to emulate her. Cornish reportedly bolstered her private security measures after growing unnerved by the fan's behavior and afraid for her own personal safety. Number 3. Rohit Sharma. Rohit Sharma became fixated on a female server after having had a brief interaction with her at a shop in Wembley, northwest London in November of 2017. According to a police report on the matter, 28-year-old Sharma returned to the store later that same day with his father. He proposed to the unidentified woman described as being in her 20s, despite having only just met her. The unidentified woman rejected Sharma, and after he'd continued to pursue her for the next several days, she reportedly quit her job. Sharma tracked down her new place of work and began bombarding her with multiple texts, phone calls, and social media messages every day. In February of 2018, she officially reported her stalker to the police, at which point he was issued a harassment warning. It proved ineffective, and Sharma resumed his incessant stalking until he was formally charged in July of that year. He became a fugitive from justice after failing to show up for a scheduled court appearance in November and remained on the run until the following April, when he was taken back into custody. Sharma ultimately pleaded guilty to charges of stalking, harassment, and failing to appear in court. He was consequently jailed for a term of 29 months, after which it was ordered that he be considered for deportation back to his native country of India. Number 2. John Dubis. In August of 2013, staff members at Jennifer Lopez's pool house discovered that a 49-year-old man who'd been stalking the singer had been secretly living on her multi-million-dollar Hamptons property for 6 days. Subsequent reports identified the individual as John Dubis, a retired firefighter who, under the pseudonym David A. Lopez, routinely posted messages on social media about his obsessive infatuation with the famed celebrity. Fortunately, she was out of town at the time of his extended home invasion. Initially, neighbors believed Dubis's car, which was parked in front of the house, belonged to a friend of Lopez's. He went largely unnoticed by the grounds staff as well, reportedly spending his nights on a couch in the pool shed. He uploaded several images to his social media accounts that investigators believed were taken at various locations on the mansion's grounds. In the captions of his disturbing posts, Dubis boasted about purportedly marrying Lopez and fathering her children. Local police eventually found him on the property and placed him under arrest, charging him with stalking, burglary, criminal contempt, and possessing burglary tools. It subsequently emerged that prior to him breaking into her home, Lopez had taken out a restraining order against Dubis. Number 1. Augustin Lucas Mariani. Police in Miami Beach, Florida, were dispatched to a local apartment after receiving reports of a stabbing at about 6:30 p.m. on November the 29th of 2021. Upon their arrival, the responding officers found 20-year-old Augustin Lucas Mariani lying on top of a young woman later identified as Delphina Pan, aged 29. Both of them had sustained critical stab wounds, and paramedics at the scene attempted life-saving procedures before taking them to Jackson Memorial Hospital. Pan was pronounced dead a short time later, while Mariani ultimately survived what the authorities determined had been. Following an investigation into the incident, detectives discovered that Mariani and Pan had worked together at the Kansas Bar and Grill restaurant in South Beach. According to testimony provided by some of the pair's co-workers, Mariani, a bartender, had asked Pan out on several occasions, in spite of repeated rejections which witnesses reported had been tactfully expressed by the woman. Mariani continued to harass her for months as his obsession with her continued to grow. On the evening of Pan's death, she'd left work early for unknown reasons. The restaurant's manager later revealed that Mariani inexplicably left a short time later as well. An eyewitness claimed to have seen the young man at Pan's apartment, where he laid in wait until her arrival, at which point he attacked her with a knife. After fatally stabbing the victim, Mariani. Following his release from the hospital, he was booked into county jail and charged with second-degree murder. Number 7. James H. Legg. Georgia woman Rose Campbell was pulled over in the city of Alpharetta on May the 4th of 2018 after swerving into a police officer's lane and nearly causing a collision. The 65-year-old was subsequently issued a citation for failure to maintain lane. The officer then presented Campbell with a ticket and told her to sign it. As per state law, it would have served as an acknowledgement that she'd been made properly aware of her alleged offense, as well as of the date and time of her scheduled court appearance. Campbell refused to provide her signature, however, as she believed that doing so would have constituted an admission of guilt. In a video captured by the officer's body camera, the woman was shown requesting to speak with a supervisor after she'd been asked to exit her vehicle. The officer then called for backup, and as other members of law enforcement arrived at the scene, the situation rapidly escalated. Campbell attempted to shut her driver's side door, but one of the officers, James H. Legg, forcefully pushed it back open and began yelling at her. He also indicated that the car's tinted windows were making him fear for his safety. Officer Legg then shouted a barrage of profanities at Campbell as he demanded she get out of her car. The volatile traffic stop culminated with the officer grabbing the woman by the arm and forcefully dragging her out of the vehicle before placing her in handcuffs. In the wake of the incident, the Alpharetta Police Department opened an internal investigation into the matter, which ultimately led to Officer Legg resigning from his position. Number 6. The shooting of Charles Galloway. Shortly after 12 a.m. on January the 23rd of 2022, Harris County Deputy Charles Galloway initiated a traffic stop on a white Toyota Avalon in southwest Houston. As was later gathered from eyewitness testimony, the driver got out of the vehicle while Galloway was still in his patrol car and immediately opened fire. The officer was struck by multiple bullets and succumbed to his injuries at the scene. The gunman, identified as 51-year-old Oscar Rosales, fled in his vehicle after the ambush attack. Following a brief manhunt, the suspect was located at a hotel in Ciudad de Acuña, Mexico, where he was placed under arrest and charged with capital murder. It subsequently emerged that Rosales had been a fugitive from justice in Harris County ever since he'd absconded from his parole following an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon conviction in 1995. Rosales had also been wanted in connection to a murder previously committed in El Salvador, and the authorities revealed an intention of contacting other Central American countries to notify them of his capture. 4 additional people face criminal charges for allegedly trying to cover up Rosales' involvement in Galloway's killing. The slain officer, who'd been a 12-year veteran of the force and a field trainer, was honored during a public funeral ceremony that included a 21-gun salute and a helicopter flyover. Number 5. Haley Marie Aiken. On January the 10th of 2019, as she was traveling northbound down Interstate 45 in Conroe, Texas, Haley Marie Aiken was pulled over by a state trooper for driving erratically. Subsequent reports detailed how as soon as the officer had exited his patrol car and begun to approach Aiken's vehicle, the 22-year-old sped away from the scene. The trooper rushed back in his car and pursued the suspect, who was eventually tracked down after exiting the interstate onto Gladstone Street. According to the resulting arrest report, Aiken had displayed clear signs of intoxication while being evaluated by the officer, and she allegedly had difficulty standing up after getting out of her vehicle. She was consequently taken into custody and charged with evading arrest with a vehicle, driving while intoxicated, and bribery. The latter charge stemmed from the young woman allegedly offering money to the state trooper in exchange for a release, a proposition which he promptly rejected. Number 4. Michael McGillis. Mariah Valenzuela was pulled over by a police officer in Phoenix, Arizona, for crossing over the painted center line prior to making a left turn in January of 2020. As was captured on Officer Michael McGillis' body cam, he'd initiated his interaction with the 23-year-old by requesting her license. Venezuela responded by claiming she didn't have any form of identification with her and demanded an explanation for the traffic stop. The officer, who later described the young woman as verbally non-compliant to investigators, was then heard telling her to place her hands behind her back before reaching for his handcuffs. A brief struggle subsequently ensued, in the course of which Officer McGillis caused Valenzuela to topple to the ground. He then pulled the young woman to her feet and handcuffed her as she protested his use of force. After Valenzuela continued to argue with him, the officer shoved her against the side of her car and asked why she refused to act like a young lady. Following her arrest, Valenzuela was charged with numerous offenses, including resisting arrest and DUI, in spite of the fact that her blood alcohol level was reported as being well below the legal driving limit. Prosecutors later reduced her charges to a single traffic ticket for failing to drive on the right side of the road. In July of 2020, Valenzuela launched a civil complaint against Officer McGillis, alleging false arrest and imprisonment. She also came forward with the footage from her brutal run-in with the officer, which had left her with bruises all over her body. According to ABC 15 in Arizona, Officer McGillis had been the subject of multiple formal complaints from people who reported he'd used foul language or unnecessary force during traffic stops in the past. Number 3. Holly Hurt. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on March the 2nd of 2021, an Indiana state trooper in Evansville initiated a traffic stop with a moped rider who'd been operating the vehicle without lights. Upon asking the female driver a series of routine questions, the officer, only identified as Trooper Stewart, recorded that she was driving with a suspended license and expired plates. Stewart also noted that the 37-year-old, who was later named as Boonville resident Holly Hurt, had been showing visible signs of impairment throughout their interaction. The officer thus conducted a sequence of field sobriety tests, during which Hurt allegedly attacked him. She kicked and bit Stewart before he was eventually able to restrain her and place her in handcuffs. Both Stewart and Hurt were subsequently treated for minor injuries at Ascension St. Vincent Hospital, after which the latter was transported to Vanderburgh County Jail, where she was held without bond. Hurt was ultimately charged with operating a vehicle while intoxicated, resisting law enforcement, and battery on a police officer, which is a Class 6 felony in the state of Indiana. Number 2. The arrest of Shibani Balsava and Shilani Sen. Shilani Sen was helping her friend Shibani Balsava move into a new apartment in Los Angeles, California, on February the 8th of 2020, when the U-Haul truck they'd rented was pulled over by the police. Balsava, a film producer, later detailed how she and Sen were confused by the stop, as they hadn't committed any traffic violations. Within moments of the traffic stop being initiated, several additional police vehicles arrived at the scene, and at least 10 members of law enforcement reportedly surrounded the U-Haul with their guns drawn. The occupants of the vehicle were ordered to get out and walk into the middle of the street with their hands above their heads. As Sen and Balsava complied with law enforcement's demands, they reportedly noticed that a police helicopter was flying overhead as well. The two women were forced to lay in the road with their limbs spread apart for several minutes before they were eventually approached by officers. Balsava later claimed that one of the officers thrusted their knee into her lower back and pushed her head down, as they then yanked her arms back and handcuffed her. She and Sen were pulled to their feet and pinned against the side of a patrol car, with guns aimed at them, at which point they were informed that the U-Haul they were driving had previously been reported stolen. Balsava told them that her receipt from the rental truck company was in her purse. Once officers retrieved it from the front seat of the vehicle and ran the two women's names through the police database, Sen and Balsava were released without being charged. It later emerged that U-Haul had reported that the stolen vehicle was recovered, and Los Angeles police had therefore initiated the traffic stop erroneously. In May of 2021, it was reported that Sen and Balsava were filing a federal lawsuit against the city of Los Angeles and its police department, accusing the officers at the scene that day of excessive force, unreasonable search and seizure, negligence, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Number 1. Mohammed Rodwan. Police Constable Stuart Oughton pulled over an uninsured white van in Leighton, East London on August the 7th of 2019. During what the 29-year-old officer had expected to be a routine traffic stop, he was viciously attacked by the driver of the vehicle, later identified as Mohammed Rodwan, aged 59. The latter repeatedly struck the officer in the head with a 2-foot-long machete, which was reported as having a rusty blade. Although PC Oughton had suffered several critical injuries in the onslaught, including 6 deep puncture head wounds and multiple skull fractures, he ultimately managed to deploy his taser in his attacker's direction. The weapon successfully subdued Rodwan and allowed the officer to call for assistance. In January of the following year, Rodwan was acquitted of attempted murder following a trial at the Old Bailey. He was, however, convicted of wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm and consequently imprisoned for a term of 16 years. In the aftermath of the incident, Officer Oughton was dubbed Britain's hardest cop due to the manner he'd handled the situation. It was also reported that he'd been awarded the National Police Federation Bravery Award for single-handedly fighting off his attacker after having sustained multiple stab wounds and bone fractures. Number 8. Sharita Dixon Cole. Texas State Trooper Daniel Hubbard pulled over a female motorist on suspicion of drunk driving in the early hours of May the 20th of 2018. The woman, Sharita Dixon Cole, was ultimately arrested and charged with driving while intoxicated. In the incident's wake, she publicly accused Officer Hubbard of forcefully groping her inside and outside of his patrol car during the course of the traffic stop. The 37-year-old's claims quickly spread online, with the help of prominent social activist Sean King and attorney Lee Merritt, both of whom shared various posts about the alleged assault. In response to Dixon Cole's accusations, the Texas Department of Public Safety released a 2-hour-long video of Officer Hubbard's body cam footage from the evening of the traffic stop. In the recording, Dixon Cole was shown performing a series of field sobriety tests, all of which she failed. The woman was then taken into custody and booked into the Ellis County Jail. At no point was Officer Hubbard shown to have exhibited any of the abusive behavior detailed in Dixon Cole's allegations. She subsequently issued a formal apology to the policeman and admitted that the assault had been a fabrication. The false claims were susceptible to legal action, but the Ellis County District Attorney announced that no additional charges would be filed against Dixon Cole other than the original count of driving while intoxicated. Number 7. Vanessa Blanchard. On October the 29th of 2021, a school resource officer in Clarksville, Tennessee, contacted Vanessa Blanchard to inquire as to why her child hadn't been attending school in recent days. Blanchard claimed that her 12-year-old son, whom subsequent reports indicated suffered from autism, had passed away following a seizure 2 days earlier. Officials at New Providence Middle School subsequently raised money in an effort to help the 39-year-old mother pay for her son's funeral. Suspicions arose after school staff contacted the funeral home Blanchard claimed to be using and were told that no arrangements were being made for the boy in question. Upon being presented with this information, Blanchard claimed that she was still waiting for the autopsy results from Tenover Hospital before setting plans for the funeral into motion. Further suspicious revelations came to light, however, after the laptop issued to Blanchard's son by the school was found to be active at the Vacation Motor Hotel in Clarksville. Montgomery County Sheriff's deputies were dispatched to the hotel, where they reportedly found Blanchard's son alive and by himself in one of the rooms. The boy's mother ultimately admitted to faking his death and leaving him at the hotel for 2 weeks, during which she claimed to have periodically checked in on him. Blanchard was consequently arrested and charged with contributing to the delinquency of a child and false impression of death. Number 5. Rachel Matisse. In the early morning hours of June the 23rd of 2016, Rachel Matisse went missing while she was on a camping trip with her family near Wells, New York. The 24-year-old's disappearance triggered a massive search effort throughout the Adirondack Mountains that came to include over 100 state police officers, rangers, and volunteers. In the weeks that followed, state authorities received and followed up on roughly 400 leads from the public, but none of them yielded any results. Then on July the 6th, the search came to a sudden conclusion when Matisse showed up at her family's Johnstown residence. She claimed to have been kidnapped by a bearded man in his 50s or 60s who smelled strongly of cigarettes. Matisse also detailed how her alleged abductor had repeatedly assaulted her and held her captive in a shed before eventually dropping her off 2 blocks from her family's house. The police were able to use Matisse's description to create a composite sketch of the suspect that was subsequently released to the public. In a surprising twist of events, however, it was announced that a warrant had been issued for Matisse's arrest on July the 23rd. Upon detecting several inconsistencies between Matisse's story and certain pieces of electronic and medical evidence, investigators concluded that the young woman had fabricated her abduction entirely. Furthermore, eyewitnesses revealed that they'd seen Matisse at a camp belonging to a relative's boyfriend during the period in which she was supposedly missing. She was ultimately charged with falsely reporting an incident, and in June of 2017, she was sentenced to 4 weeks in jail, 3 years of probation, and 100 hours of community service. Number 4. Trent Freeman. A former sheriff's deputy from Gilchrist County, Florida, was taken into custody in December of 2021 after it was discovered that she'd lied about being hospitalized with COVID-19. According to related reports from local news outlet WCJB, 38-year-old Trent Freeman claimed to have been admitted to the hospital after contracting the virus in the fall of 2021. Over the next 2 months, the deputy allegedly forged multiple doctors' signatures and falsified her medical records to maintain the fraudulent claim that she'd become comatose while undergoing treatment. Freeman was actually in perfect health and had begun working full-time at what was described as a private sector non-law enforcement job. Her superiors at the county sheriff's office began to suspect her fraud in early October. Following an investigation by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, it was determined that Freeman had been lying about her medical condition, therefore swindling her colleagues out of more than $3,700 in paid sick time. After Freeman was fired from her position on October the 15th, a warrant was issued for her arrest. She ultimately turned herself in, whereupon she was charged with 2 counts of uttering a forged instrument and 1 count of scheme to defraud. Number 3. Timothy Wilkes. Shortly after 9 p.m. on February the 5th of 2021, police officers in Nashville, Tennessee were dispatched to the parking lot of an urban air indoor trampoline park in response to reports of a shooting on the premises. 23-year-old David Starnes Jr. openly admitted to the officers that he'd fatally shot an individual later named as Timothy Wilkes, aged 20. Starnes denied initiating the deadly altercation and reported that it was Wilkes who'd first approached a group of people while wielding a butcher knife and claiming that he was going to rob them. Starnes, who was a part of the group being threatened, sought to defend himself and the others by pulling out a handgun and firing at Wilkes. The authorities later determined that Wilkes, a local YouTuber, and his friend had been attempting to film a video in which they captured the reactions of people being held at knife point. The prank robbery ultimately had a dramatic outcome for the young man, who failed to anticipate the possibility that one of the video's subjects might act in self-defense to his fake attack. As of the latest updates on the matter, neither Starnes nor Wilkes' friend had been charged in connection to the incident. Number 2. Ava Coleman and Christopher Kratzer. At about 6 p.m. on July the 3rd of 2019, several concerned citizens contacted the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office in Georgia to report a suspected kidnapping in the parking lot of the Collection Shopping Center. According to eyewitness testimony, 17-year-old Ava Coleman was crying out for help and screaming, "He's going to kill me," while sitting in a Chevrolet Tahoe with her hands bound and head covered by what appeared to be a pillowcase. 8 sheriff's deputies were rushed to the scene in a swift and ample law enforcement response that reportedly included more than half of the South Forsyth police force. The vehicle in which Coleman had been seen was subsequently located at another nearby parking lot, and law enforcement initiated a traffic stop. The occupants were ordered out of the vehicle at gunpoint. Shortly thereafter, it was discovered that the alleged kidnapping had actually been a hoax devised by Coleman and 19-year-old Christopher Kratzer. The teens had reportedly planned to film the elaborate stunt in order to post it on social media. Although no one was harmed during the incident, a spokesman for the county sheriff's office contended that Coleman and Kratzer were fortunate the situation hadn't escalated further. They'd fabricated a high-tension scenario that could have resulted in them or other members of the public being hurt. The pair consequently faced felony charges of raising a false alarm and a misdemeanor count of reckless conduct. Number 1. Jessica Ann Smith. Through a Facebook post from June of 2019, Pennsylvania resident Jessica Ann Smith announced that she'd been diagnosed with colon cancer. The 31-year-old was quickly met with an overwhelmingly sympathetic response. On the 10th of the month, she created a Facebook fundraiser titled #FightLikeAJessica, which she used to raise money for her purported extensive medical bills. Smith also allegedly started a GoFundMe campaign towards the same end, and she ultimately received more than $10,000 in donations across the 2 fundraising platforms. The authorities were first notified of the situation on June the 19th, when a female acquaintance of Smith's contacted the Euclid Township Police Department. She reportedly stated that to the best of her knowledge, Smith hadn't actually been diagnosed with cancer of any form. On July the 31st, Smith's husband filed an official police report in which he alleged that his wife had fraudulently obtained the Facebook and GoFundMe donations under the false pretense that she was ill. He also revealed that he knew for a fact that Smith hadn't been diagnosed with cancer, as she was covered on the medical insurance he received through his employer. In November of 2019, Smith was arrested and charged with theft by deception and other theft-related counts. She was ultimately sentenced to 3 years of probation and mental health treatment in January of 2021. Number 8. Chloe Palmer. On November the 25th of 2017, a girls' night out in the town of Watford, England, descended into complete chaos when an argument broke out on the car ride home. The designated driver for the evening was Cristala Amphlett, aged 19. While travelling down the M1 motorway that connects London and Leeds, Amphlett got into a passionate exchange with one of her backseat passengers, a young woman named Maisie O'Flynn. Their dispute was about Amphlett asking for petrol money from the three girls she was driving home. At one point in the argument, Amphlett pulled the car over to the shoulder and switched off the ignition in order to focus her full attention on O'Flynn. According to the vehicle's GPS, the car was stationary for a total of 17 minutes as the discussion continued. Amphlett had the headlights turned off and neglected to activate the car's hazard signal while it sat motionless on the side of the road. Nearby roadway lights were not illuminated either, so the vehicle was nearly invisible to oncoming traffic. Others had to swerve out of the way of the parked vehicle due to the fact that Amphlett had the driver's door open and her legs sticking out towards the road as she addressed O'Flynn in the seat behind her. Suddenly, another vehicle crashed into the back of Amphlett's Renault Twingo. The brutal collision caused multiple severe injuries not only to Amphlett and O'Flynn, but also to Chloe Palmer, the 19-year-old girl sitting next to O'Flynn in the back seat. Palmer sustained major brain damage and ultimately passed away in the hospital roughly a week later. Although the case was brought to court to determine whether Amphlett should be held responsible for her friend's death, she was eventually acquitted in December of 2020. Following the ruling, Amphlett posted a video to Snapchat in which she could be seen celebrating with a bottle of champagne. Number 7. Jose Meza. An argument between siblings in Calum, Mississippi, ultimately led to a deadly shooting on the night of April the 26th of 2021. Jose Meza was engaged in a fierce disagreement with his sister, 24-year-old Scott County resident Erica Meza. The triggering factor in their argument was a key. As the dispute reached its explosive conclusion, Erica took out a firearm and released a round into her brother's chest. Jose was rushed to Scott Regional Hospital and immediately tended to by medical professionals in the emergency room. Upon realizing the injured man had suffered a gunshot wound, doctors at the hospital contacted the Scott County Sheriff's Office. In spite of the hospital's best efforts, the victim was pronounced dead. Erica Meza was soon brought into police custody and charged with the first-degree murder of her own brother. She was held in county jail and denied bail by a judge while she awaited her trial. Number 6. Keeland Ahmad Pickens. When the US's #1 ranked college football team suffered an upset loss on October the 9th of 2021, events were set in motion that culminated in the death of 27-year-old Keeland Ahmad Pickens. The Alabama Crimson Tide were defeated by the Texas A&M Aggies, an outcome deemed unexpected by most college football fans. While attending a watch party in Bessemer, Alabama, Pickens soon became embroiled in an intense argument about which team was better with Emmanuel Talbot III, aged 20. The homeowner asked the two men to leave as tensions between them continued to escalate. Once outside, Talbot resorted to violence to settle the dispute. Shots were fired, Pickens was struck, and Talbot fled the scene. People rushed outside and found the victim with multiple gunshot wounds to his torso. He was transported to UAB hospital but later passed away from his injuries. Talbot was on the run for only a couple of days before he turned himself into Bessemer police. In addition to Pickens' murder, Talbot also faced charges from an incident in November of 2020 in which he and 3 others had robbed a man at gunpoint. Number 5. Alessandro Diaz Jr. 27-year-old Alessandro Diaz Jr. of Fresno County, California, met a violent end after getting into a contentious argument on his lunch break. Diaz was a forklift driver at Brevant Produce's plant in Reedley and on April the 13th of 2021 made his way down to Oaks Mini Mart with a few of his co-workers. While browsing the convenience store, Diaz got into a verbal altercation with another patron named David Cedino, aged 26. Their dispute was reportedly gang-related as both individuals were later discovered to have ties to gangs in the area. Employees at the mini-mart recounted to police that the two men yelled at each other for a short while before Cedino threw up his hands in disgust and left the store. Diaz and his co-workers subsequently made their way back to work. Unbeknownst to them, however, Cedino had started following the men back to the Brevant Produce packing plant. As Diaz got out of his car and walked across the parking lot, Cedino approached him in his own vehicle and shot him. The victim was taken to Adventist Health where he was pronounced dead. A warrant was issued for Cedino's arrest on May the 28th after Reedley police identified him on surveillance tapes taken from the mini-mart and other surrounding businesses. The very next day, he was found and arrested by the Missouri State Highway Patrol. He was charged with murder and felon in possession of a firearm. Number 4. Calvin Durham II. A heated argument over a Facebook post ultimately led to the fatal shooting of 37-year-old Calvin Durham II in a barbershop in Norfolk, Virginia. Durham's dispute with Fareed Nelson Luckett began around 12:30 p.m. on June the 4th of 2021. The pair got into an altercation in the parking lot outside of the Capital Cuts barbershop, eventually needing to be separated by a few of the shop's employees. Nelson Luckett was taken inside while Durham was left in the lot. That wasn't the end of the argument, however, as not long after their initial separation, Durham stormed back into the shop and confronted Nelson Luckett over one of his Facebook posts. The fight turned physical once again, and Nelson Luckett got a hold of Durham's firearm in the midst of the struggle. Durham was shot with his own weapon and Nelson Luckett was wounded as well, but his injuries were not life-threatening. Durham, the son of a local pastor, would later pass away while receiving treatment at Centara Norfolk General Hospital, while Nelson Luckett was charged with second-degree murder. Number 3. Tatiana and Adair. In May of 2021, a Russian man simply identified as Adair was suffocated under the weight of his 225-pound wife named Tatiana. The couple had reportedly gotten into a drunken argument before the fatal incident occurred. Tatiana became so enraged at her husband that she pinned him beneath her backside and quite literally sat on him to death. She insisted to Russian police that she had no intention of killing him, but only sought to calm him down by physically restraining him. Their daughter, upset at the sight of her mother crushing the life out of her father, ran to the neighbors for help, but they deemed the situation a domestic dispute and left the couple to settle it on their own. Adair passed away while stuck between his wife and their mattress. His official cause of death was asphyxia from blocking the respiratory system. After her husband stopped showing signs of life, a panicked Tatiana tried to shake him awake, to no avail. She was initially charged with murder, but that allegation was dropped in favor of criminal negligence, of which she was eventually convicted. She was forced to serve 18 months of corrective labor in order to pay £2,000 in moral damages. A 29-year-old resident of Portland, Oregon, named Alexandra R. Bloodgood was shot dead by her own brother-in-law following a heated argument that turned violent. The initial dispute took place between the victim's husband, Jordan Arb, and his 25-year-old brother, Shane Finnell, on May the 16th of 2021. Though the specifics of their disagreement were not revealed in the immediate aftermath, the brothers' fight was reportedly centered on the seemingly trivial subject of laundry. As the argument escalated, Arb threw a potted plant at his brother. Finnell then approached a seated Arb Bloodgood who was facing away from the two men. He pulled out a chrome-plated revolver and shot his sister-in-law in the back of the head, execution style. After hearing the gunshot go off, a next-door neighbor went downstairs to determine the source of the commotion and noticed Finnell on the porch across the street. He was flailing his arms and looked extremely distraught. The neighbor walked over to check on him, at which point Finnell confessed to the killing and asked the man to call the police. When the authorities arrived, Finnell repeated his chilling admission, saying, "I did a horrible thing," as Portland officers took him into custody. He was charged with second-degree murder and unlawful use of a weapon. Thanks for watching.